This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider.
I can't see any of you in front of me. There's no one to clap or heckle. And I don't know about you, but I have had more than enough of this disease.
Today should have marked Boris Johnson's equivalent of a Roman triumph. Instead, MPs are left wondering if the Prime Minister, who was all-conquering a year ago, is the man to lead them to the 2024 election, as the pandemic teases out his and his government's faults. Our editorial column says the PM has one central task: lead Britain through this crisis with the right mix of optimism and realism.
Boris Johnson may wish things were different. He must nevertheless grasp the nettle and deal with matters as they are. The government's central role at present divides into three major tasks. One is to get to grips with test and trace, which is not up to scratch. The second concerns communication. The government has not been clear enough on its new rules in the pandemic or on the scientific reasoning behind them. Mr. Johnson has meanwhile tended to overpromise. The third is to address the next big challenge: how to handle a vaccine should it come. The government must get its plans straight now and then make them clear to the rest of us.
It's been a busy day in our Westminster office, where Sophia Sleigh joins me now. Sophia, under what circumstances had the PM hoped to find himself in today?
Well, certainly last year when he gave his speech, we were up in Manchester, and he had hundreds, well, probably thousands actually, in the hall cheering him on, and his family in the front row slapping him on the back and stuff, and ministers on top form. So it was the complete opposite this year. It was completely different to what he could have hoped for in terms of a performance. There was no audience, so a lot of his jokes were, no applause, no laughter, and that was a bit surreal watching that.
And then there's the political situation he finds himself in, leading the country through a pandemic and an economic crisis.
Yeah, well, it was certainly not what he would have hoped for, having won that stonking majority back in December, and he's now faced with this pandemic. But he did divert from that, I thought, quite quickly. He obviously talked about the pandemic at the beginning, but he seemed quite keen to get off that subject, and I the bulk of the speech was sort of hope, optimism, and talking about home ownership and wind farms and everything else. So he was keen to get off that rather dour topic.
So what did he choose to focus on then?
Stuff of substance, I suppose. He talked about home ownership and turning generation rent into generation buy, care homes, offshore wind farms, and one-to-one teaching as well, actually, for pupils came up as well, which, all sound great, but, soon after his speech, Westminster journalists, we have a briefing by the spokesman for the Prime Minister, and we did ask for further details on that, on all those policies pretty much, and I have to say, quite frankly, there wasn't much detail coming through on that. For example, the 95% fixed rate mortgages he was talking about, the spokesman couldn't give us a time frame or say how it would be done, and kept referring back to the Prime Minister's speech or what he'd said at the weekend on Andrew Marr show. So I think it's fair to say that journalists are going to be really pushing for details on a lot of what he said today. It didn't really feel good enough to announce all this and not really back it up with much substance.
And do you have a sense of how the Conservative Party has responded?
Yeah, so I think it's early for now to see how people have reacted. Certainly on Twitter, lots of people seem very chuffed and buoying him on and stuff. But it was clear as well from that speech that I thought it was quite a people-pleasing speech, in that he was tackling criticism he's getting from the party as well as the public and the Labour Party, but in particular his party, those powerful backbenchers that are quite angry at the moment. Some of them have been really cross about sort of state encroachments on civil liberties and stuff like that, and he was definitely talking to them directly at points in that speech. He said, I deeply regret the restrictions, and basically said there's no other way though, and he promises to roll back the state as soon as possible. He was definitely trying to calm them and please them. So I think time will tell what their reaction is.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.